All right, welcome everybody. My name is Heather Kingery and I work for the Nebraska Forest Service. I'm the forest products specialist there. I've been there since 2015 and I've been working on biochar stuff in one way or another for nearly a decade at this point, which is really hard to believe. So I'm really happy to be here to talk about biochar with all of you, and gonna split this time with Evrett Lunquist, who's like using it, and we'll have a lot of great information. So we're gonna kind of try to split up the presentation that way. So for those of you who didn't know that we have a Nebraska Forest Service, we do. We do a lot of work with windbreak renovations, tree planting, forest management. If you have like a woodlot, we offer a lot of services. And forest products is just one part of what we do. And we are affiliated with the University of Nebraska. So we are like similar to Extension, but just for forestry. So how many people, I always like to start with this, how many people in here have heard of biochar, know what it is? Great, oh my gosh, that's amazing. So when I started doing biochar presentations, when I came on staff in 2015, I would maybe get like a few hands that would raise. And like now, like almost everybody in this room, I think, raised their hand. So how many of you, follow-up question, are using biochar, have used biochar, have made biochar? All right, yeah, that's great. That was like the number of hands that I would see go up when it was like people who knew what it was. So I think that we've come a long way, and I'd like to get a lot more hands up in this room of people who have tried making it or have tried using it, and really to hear more about your experience. So biochar is this carbon-rich material that is made when you burn biomass at really high temperatures in the absence of oxygen. So there's a number of different ways to do this. You can do pyrolysis or gasification. And those details are kind of getting in the weeds for what I want to talk about today. But the main focus is just you want to really limit the oxygen. And the main difference between charcoal, which we're familiar with for cooking, and biochar is really the intended end use. So we think of charcoals as being used for cooking, for fuel, and biochars as having primarily an environmental application. So the historical context of biochar, I think, is really interesting. It was first, I guess, identified in the Amazon basin, and it's called terra preta, which means black earth. And these were pre-Columbian anthropogenic soils, which is just a really fancy way of saying these were made before Spanish colonization of South America, and they're human-made. So these soils were impacted by the populations who lived in this area. And we know that because they contain animal manures like pottery shards, bones, and this charcoal, right? It was all burned and kind of maybe then smothered with the soil in the area. We get these really dark soils. Today, we can go down to the Amazon, we can still observe these, and what they find is that the above ground biomass on these terra preta soils is greater than similar adjacent soils that were not impacted by humans. You can see just a little, this is like a really popular picture if you've done any biochar research on your own. You've probably seen this picture of these terra preta soils with corn grown up on top and then the adjacent non-terra preta soils. So the big takeaway about what biochar is that it's this solid carbon material. It's produced from organic matter, so if you are incinerating tires, you are not making biochar, okay? This is not an organic material. So organic matter, that can be agricultural residues. We focus a lot here in Nebraska on woody residues, especially eastern red cedar for forest restoration and pasture management. Biochar is resistant to decomposition. So we know that these ancient soils have this carbon. We can do carbon dating science on it and see that the carbon in there has lasted for 2,000 years. So we know that this carbon is resistant to decomposing, and it's not used for heating. So biochar is kind of like a new purpose that we're using it for, but not a new material. And you already know what biochar is. Well, you guys actually do, because you all raised your hands. But if you didn't, I would be telling you, you already know what it is, because we use biochar in our everyday lives. It's more of like an umbrella term for a spectrum of products that are made from carbon. So this is graphite. You've made a campfire, and you have some coals or burning embers, and then you put it out with water. What you have, that carbon material left over, is biochar. What we see left over after a forest fire, prairie fire, is similar to a biochar. Our charcoal, really popular now, are like activated carbon or biochar, charcoal, like health products. Right? So your like face wash and your toothpaste and your hair mask and all the things that you want to do, you can get them with charcoal or activated carbon in it.
You can use it for overdose patients to suck up the poison in their gut.
Yes, absolutely. That's probably like one of the oldest examples that we know, like in modern times, of like using charcoal, right?
You want to be out of the way when they...
Yeah. So when we think about biochar, it's really important to think about it on these different scales. So we have our macro scale, that's, us, Apple, things you can see. You have the micro scale, so that's like our bacteria, and up here the example is the human hair, and then we have the nanoscale, that's like the molecular level of what's going on. And it's formed by heat, and so what happens then at these micro and nanoscales is a transformation of the structure of the carbon. So I think this top picture is my favorite. This is what wood looks like under a microscope. You have your large pores in there that are used to transport water and nutrients through the tree. And those pores are still in there when we make biochar. What we're really doing is just burning off or pyrolyzing all of the excess non-carbon components of the tree, and that structure remains, and it's even sometimes expanded. So we really increase our surface area, and we get rid of all the stuff that's not carbon. We do that just by adding heat. And this is all important because we like to think of biochar as this like luxury condo for microbes, okay? So it has food, it has water, and it has electricity included. And as my friend and colleague Kelpie Wilson likes to say, microbes like to sit down when they eat. So they have everything they need. And you can see in this picture, this is the surface of biochar, and you can see all the arrows here are pointing to different microbial life that is on the surface of that biochar. And electricity is really important. I'll try to not go too deep into this, but I will ask you all to just think fondly back on your high school or college chemistry classes. Personally, was not my favorite. I like plants, I like things that I can see. But what we know is that biochar is electrically charged. And this is really important because these electrons are assisting in the biological processes of these microbes and the mycorrhizae and these chemical tasks that are required to sustain life. And some of these microbes that are in the soil can survive solely on electricity. So this is pretty important. Okay, moving off of the electrons onto the water, something a little bit easier here. Biochar has an extremely high surface area. Typically what we see in biochars is up to 600 meters squared per gram. Larger than that, we typically think of that as like an activated carbon or activated charcoal. And this can really increase the water retention if you're adding your biochar to soils, because it has this porosity. It can hold many times its weight in water. I read an article this week that was based on a Nebraska study. I think it was published by the Center for Rural Affairs, who I saw is here, that there was a study done that showed that adding biochar to agricultural soils reduced irrigation needs by 37%. Just like, that's real money, right? Like, we're talking about real implications and real benefits for the biochar.
How big is the size of
The biochar,
the 600 meter square?
I think that's typically like a finer ground biochar that's going to have that really high surface area.
So is that the size that you want for spreading into your field?
That's a great question. I think what we typically hear, or common knowledge, is that the smaller the particle size, the better, because it incorporates more easily into the soil. It has more surface area for all of these things to happen on, right? The microbial activity, the water. But every step in the process of making biochar adds cost. And so it's trying to find the balance between what size is realistic and, you know, how much do you have to grind it down to get it to work. And I do have biochar samples over here that you are all welcome to take. I would love to not take any back to Lincoln with me. And some publications as well. But yeah, the finer, the better.
And one thing I've noticed with biochar is like you remove all the organic compounds and you leave just the carbon. And so you have the skeletal structure. It doesn't matter how finely you grind it. You have the surface area. And I just did the math. So basically in 1 gram of biochar, there's going to be as much surface area as 0.14 acres. So 1/10 of an acre is going to exist of surface area in 1 gram of biochar. And if anybody thinks about, you know, life is in the margins, like life happens on the margins, you're creating those margins by adding biochar to your soil.
I think I've also heard like a teaspoon of biochar has the surface area of a football field. Like, yeah. But just kind of some rough estimations of the surface area of it. Biochar also, because of its electric charge, binds really well to other things in the soil. So this was a really important paper that came out, oh gosh, probably 4 years ago now, but it was the first time where they were able to see this organic coating adhered to the surface of the biochar. And so it started to help us understand like how the biochar is actually functioning in the soil, because we were seeing like, oh, maybe we'd see improved crop yields, or we'd see plants survive, you know, extreme weather like drought or something like that, where ones without biochar wouldn't. but we didn't necessarily know how that was happening. So we're seeing it is getting, it's able to like latch on to the food it needs, the organic compounds, minerals, all of that sort of thing. And it helps to make those more bioavailable to plants. So again, kind of the improved plant growth. It can promote rhizobia, so nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and the formation of soil aggregates, which is really important, as you all, I'm sure, know. So this is a caveat I like to include in biochar presentations. So getting the most from your biochar from a gentleman named David Yarrow, who's done a lot of biochar work. But there are some concerns about adding just raw biochar to your soil. And so his recommendations are to moisten your biochar, micronize your biochar, kind of to your question, mineralize, so that is to add rock dust, manures, compost, that sort of thing, and microbial inoculation. So again, you can get that from compost or from adding just some of your natural local microorganisms from your soil to your biochar before adding it to your garden, to your field, whatever the scenario is. So just a few knowledge gaps that I do want to acknowledge, because we often hear people talk about biochar as this like cure-all, right? Like it'll double your plant yields and you will have the best tasting whatever ever. And that is just not necessarily the case, right? Like sometimes we see really amazing results like that, but I would say biochar isn't this like cure-all, fix all of your soil issues or production issues that you have. So we know that biochars, depending on how they're made, have different properties. And so we don't always know what biochar is going to be best for what soil type. We don't always know what biochar is going to perform best with which types of crops. And there is a resource that's like a biochar database that has tried to take and inventory all these case studies of biochar and soils and crops and all of that, and try to do some matching and visually represent that data, but there's just no easy answer for those questions right now. Again, I kind of talked about how biochar actually functions in the soil. There's a lot of things we don't know about what it does for microbial life and mycorrhizal life. And yes, different effects by climate and soil type. So another thing I like to mention is that if you already have like really fertile soils and really good soil health, the benefits that you're going to see from adding biochar are not as great as if you are dealing with a really degraded soil. And I've also seen in places where like maybe you won't notice the benefits of biochar until it is a drought year, where your crops are performing the same when you are getting good rain, good climatic conditions, no severe weather. But in a drought year, you'll have your crops that are planted with biochar surviving over your crops that do not have biochar. So there are a few, policy challenges with biochar. So when you go to purchase a biochar, As I mentioned, first of all, they're not all created equal, and so we don't really have an industry standard for product rating systems. So before you purchase anything and apply it to your soil, I recommend that you request a biochar analysis from a third party that should be provided by the biochar producer, so that you really know what's in there. There's no trade association, so there's no one really lobbying for biochar to be included in like EQIP or NRCS practices or the Senate Agricultural Committee. So we do have the US Biochar Initiative, which is more of an educational nonprofit. So we do work to try to advance some of these causes, but it's an entirely volunteer-run organization, and there's no funding coming in to really support this. So because it is a relatively new industry, we're like probably, I would say, 10, 15 years behind the compost industry. There are quite a few policy challenges. And then, of course, carbon markets. That's come up a lot lately. I've been sitting in on a lot of webinars on carbon markets. And the question is, how do we account for biochar? Who gets the carbon credit? Is it the person who makes it? Is it the person who's putting it in their soil? And how do we account for that? That, it's in a farm that's going to stay a farm and not go into land use changes, conversions, be developed, and then no longer serving its purpose. So a little bit on new markets. I'm almost done. I'll turn it over to you here real quick. There are 2 NRCS practices that do support biochar. So this first one is CSP 336. So this is for a soil carbon amendment to be applied to agricultural land. And so they have some guidelines on rates. They have some guidelines on how much it pays to do this. It can be mixed with compost. It could be compost alone. But it really is about adding carbon to the soil. It's new. It's brand new. I'm not sure that anybody in Nebraska has done this yet. It was interim for a while, an interim practice, and it has been adopted. And the other one is 384, which is a woody residue management. So this is really more for forested land. And the idea is to convert the woody biomass that you're maybe removing for forest health or wildfire mitigation, and you convert that to biochar on site, and you leave it on site. And so that one pays quite a bit. I want to say like $4,000 an acre, $3,500 an acre. But again, it's very specific, let me put it that way. We've also been doing work in looking at the use of biochar for water filtration. We've been looking at the use of biochar in livestock, the livestock industry, so both in feeding biochar to beef cattle, as well as including biochar as a pen amendment, and looking at things like using biochar in construction materials. Can we offset some of the greenhouse gas intensity of the concrete industry by including some biochar? So just a few of our resources. nfs.unl.edu is my website. We have a newsletter. I have a quarterly newsletter on biochar that goes out. We call them these informal char parties where you can come out, drop in, make biochar with us, talk to us about biochar, whatever. So I like to advertise those there, try to stay up on the latest biochar news. And then, of course, the biochar-us.org is our US Biochar Initiative website, and we have what is called the Biochar Learning Center that has more resources than you would know what to do with. It'd take years, I think, to go through all of it. But it's really well organized. Don't let that intimidate you. It's well organized so that you can find what you're looking for. So I will turn it over to Everett, and then we can try to field some questions at the end.
Okay, so my name's Evrett Lunquist, and my wife and I and children, one who's here, run Common Good Farm in Raymond, Nebraska. Heather organized the first biochar workshop that I went to. It was in Ord, Nebraska. Kelpie Swanson came up out from Oregon to put that on, and didn't quite know what biochar was all about. But when I left the workshop, I was stoked. I mean, I was super excited. I mean, this is one technology or one practice that we can do that deals with brush that everybody's going to have that has a farm. Cedars invading, whatever, woody materials, whatever you got, corn stalks. I think you could probably make it out of straw if you wanted to go through that effort. But then you're going to create a soil amendment that you can add to your soil carbon, and you're going to sequester active carbon from our ecological environment and store it in the soil for potentially 2,000 to 10,000 years. I mean, talk about a climate change mitigating practice. Taking carbon out of the air, that's like a woody material, it's an active carbon cycle. So a tree grows up, falls down in the ground. That's not considered an equation factor for climate change because that's active carbon. It's actively cycling through. When you burn coal or propane or natural gas, you're adding carbon that's been sequestered in the ground for millions of years, and you're adding that to the atmosphere. Now we have a technology that you can actually, sorry, I'm going to get winded if I keep that on, sorry. Now we have something that we can do where we can actively take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back in the ground for 10,000 years. I mean, how exciting is that? What can one person do? This is what one person can do. I came back from that workshop, and we had a couple of water tanks that had leaks in them, so we put those aside. We had a pile of brush, and we just piled them in and lit it from the top, which is important. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But I want to point out how little smoke there is coming off of that. So you can make char and create a lot of smoke and add to the particulate pollution in the air. Or you can do it with a top-lit kiln like this, and all the smoke gets burnt up in the flame, and you're not adding particulate matter to the soil or to the air.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Does that require an open burn permit? But since you're on a tank, maybe it doesn't?
I asked, we're friends with the former fire chief, volunteer fire department of Raymond, and I asked him, I was like, this is what I want to do. Do I need a burn permit? And he said, I don't know. I haven't heard from him since, so we'll say no, maybe.
Question on your brush, is it only tree branches, or is it any other woody stalks?
It could be anything.
Could be anything.
Anything that's organic matter. Okay. There's when we had this workshop in Ord, there were people doing it with these big, long earth tanks, and they were burning bamboo. Very long pieces of bamboo. So your tank pretty much you want to match your tank to the material that you're working with. And we'll talk about that. I've seen it done. One of my first initial trial burns was in a barrel. Didn't work too well because there's not very much air movement that comes down in there. You get a lot of smoke. It didn't really work that well. But it's key that you do not have air coming in from the bottom. So whatever tank you have to be able to keep the air out except from the top. And you can't really see, you won't be able to see it in any of the tanks that I have here, but we extinguish the burn with water, and then you have to have a opening then to let the water drain out. But you don't want the air going into that hole when you're actually burning, because part of the magic is that you get this burn, and then it goes down, you have a nice bed of coals, you keep adding wood to it. And so what happens is the wood is burning. No, I'm sorry, that's incorrect, isn't it? The wood's not burning. The gases coming from the wood are burning. The flame is coming from the non-carbon material that's gasifying and going up into the flame. And so it's actually the what do you call it? The fume, that's not the right word. The fumes or the gasification of the wood is actually what's the flammable part. The wood does not burn directly. And so what you want to do is you want to keep that wood that's gasifying on top, and that burning then is using all the oxygen. And so you have all this heat sitting on top, but the coals, the cooking part of the fire, is oxygen absent. It's deprived of oxygen. So what you keep doing is you keep adding wood on top of the burn, and then as it starts to create a little bit of ash, then you add some more. Because the ash is the symbol that you're going from that gasification stage to the carbon burning stage. And you don't want to go into that ash stage. You don't want to burn your carbon. You want to actually store it and sequester it. And but we'll talk about that more. This was our second real attempt at a kiln. And what this is called is a top-lit flame cap kiln. The top lit, you light it from the top, and then the flame caps the kiln. So all the oxygen gets used in that flaming process. There's other systems that you can use that are, what are they called? Enclosed, you put the heat around them. Retort. Yeah, a retort kiln. And that's where you have a vessel inside, you stack it up with wood, and then you create the heat around the outside, and it gasifies it and drives off all the non-carbon material. But it's a lot of work. You don't end up with much. And I was super excited when Kelpie said, I've got an easier way than a retort kiln, because I was looking at all these different ideas of how to make it, and they all seemed very labor intensive. So what we took was a 1,000-gallon fuel barrel, never been used, but I did make sure there was no fumes in it before I started cutting it, just to be on the safe side. That involved a 20-foot stick of, or no, a 20-foot conduit with a match on the end, and I was standing behind something else, and so there's, anyway. I didn't want to blow up. So I got it cut in half, and then I put a hole right down here at the bottom, and then welded a 1-inch coupling, like pipe coupler to it, and then I used a 1-inch pipe plug to plug that hole, so that I could let the water out, but then I wasn't letting air in down below. Because anywhere air got in, you're going to be creating ash, and ash is not what you want. Ash has gone too far. Okay, so here's the tank in use. Again, top lit. There's a little bit of smoke coming in. It's just getting started. You probably don't have to stack it up quite so high, but there's the next. It's getting a little further along. The flame's consuming. Eventually, all that material is going to go down into the tank, and you have your nice bed of coals. And then you can start adding more wood to it. Here's a video that Nettie took of the burn. You don't get the benefit of the sound, I guess. We upgraded to using a skid loader to load it. We were loading all of the materials by hand initially. These are cedar trimmings. Works great if they're dry. But you don't have to have them dry, because cedar will go up in a ball of flame, even wet, because of all the oils. There's a lot of heat going on there. And the first time I did that burn with those little water tanks, I found out that the film that they put on glasses for protecting them melts. I needed a new pair of glasses. I couldn't get them clean. So then we started wearing face shields, like my son Misha here is wearing one to protect his glasses. We're all usually decked out in outerwear because it's quite intense. This is in the cow yard, so there's nothing really to catch fire around us. We did take that hose and we watered everything down because the cinders were blowing off a little bit to one side. This happened we were doing this at night. The neighbors over the hillside came home that night and were driving up their hill and gave us a call saying, "There's something burning at your place." And they were quite concerned about us, and my wife said, "Nope, no, it's fine. We're just doing our char burn." So nighttime displays do tend to attract attention. You could see this from the highway, and yeah.
I will say that as a volunteer firefighter, you are definitely breaking every rule. I've seen everybody and it's a back jump.
So
Well,
we
you
were.
have a backup water supply, which is about 25 beer tanks. 50 to 100 people.
Kelpie is it Swanson? Wilson. Kelpie Wilson said she always has a bag of marshmallows in her glove box whenever she does a trial burn like this. So then you can argue that you're having a marshmallow roast. Yeah, so okay, thank you, Alex, for that, that insight there. Yeah, and so we do have a hose there for that purpose to make sure it's not going to. When I talked to Shane about it, the discussion was, well, it's inside of a container, a vessel, so is it, an open burn permit situation? He's never seen this. I did call him the night before.
I'm being a little facetious, but at nighttime, that's when everybody calls because they can see it from
Right.
a mile away.
I did call Shane before doing this to let him know. It's like, we're doing this. You know I don't have a permit. So just so you know, if there's a call that you can say, yes, it's okay. And I called him when I was done so that if there was a call that came later, they would know to respond.
He did say that if we keep it contained inside that we won't get in trouble.
Yeah.
So if it goes outside of that, then we won't get.
But he was to get an official opinion. He said he was going to have to talk to the state fire marshal to get a firm position on it. But I have never heard that firm position.
So, sorry, if I can
Yeah.
ask a question. So, at this point, you've got kind of a raging thing happening.
Yeah.
Can't look into the thing to go, oh, I've not made ash, thank goodness. I haven't gone too far. Is it just the constant feeding that
Mm-hmm.
builds it? So it's not anything else that you have to really watch other than just keep having fuel on top.
Yeah.
How do you know if it's turning to ash? You can't.
In order for it to go to ash, you have to have oxygen.
Yeah, but I mean.
The carbon does not burn unless it's in the presence of oxygen. And so if you are keeping this type of situation going on top, there's no air that can get down to the coals.
And only the wood in the bottom is really what's going to be the biochar?
Everything that you put in there is turning to biochar. Because what happens is you keep adding more material. And the only thing I regret in this whole picture presentation is I didn't take a picture of the pile of brush before. Kelpie would say that it takes 10 times the brush pile to end up with a certain amount of biochar. I mean, one, you think about a brush pile, there's a lot of air. And with the char, it's all that air is disappearing. It's crumbling, it's going down into just a very consolidated heap. But then you're also losing some volume when you from the original material. But you can't see it in the picture really well because it's the camera light, dark But when you are there, you can actually see ash starting to form on the outside of the wood. And that's your cue. When you start seeing the ash on the outside of the wood, then you add some more, because it's going to go into that carbon stage. And you want to keep that fresh fuel burning up all the oxygen. Plus, you're creating a heat layer on top of there so the stuff below continues to cook. So then when you're done, this is the ashing stage. So we've run out of fuel. This was at the workshop. That's Kelpie Wilson. And she designed this tank to be portable, like to fit into the back of a pickup truck. And then she was working with the Oregon Forestry Service. And there's a lot of, what do you call it, brush material mitigation that they're doing to prevent forest fires. And normally they just pile it up, burn it to ash. And so then the program was, well, let's turn it into char, spread it on hillsides, and renovate eroded hillsides. But you get to this ash stage, and you can still, if you were there, you'd see some flames kind of still jumping out of there. That's the sign that there's still some gasification going on. And but then once you get to the ash stage, you feel like, yeah, all the non-carbon material's been burned off. Then we quench it with water. It takes a lot of water. We're talking probably over 1,000 degrees of stuff going on there, and that's extending all the way down into the material. These are 500-gallon tanks. Usually we don't quite get them filled when we make char. So I would estimate, though, in each one of those tanks, we're probably using maybe 100 gallons of water to extinguish it. You don't want to not extinguish it. Come out in the morning, and then you find out that there's some coals in there, and now you've got a tank of ash. That was kind of a lot of effort for wood ash. And that's what you end up with at the end. You can still see kind of some of the chunks, like here maybe was a piece of lumber, here's a cedar limb. Generally what I find when I'm making the materials or getting the materials ready for char, like if I'm doing some cedar trimming, I will go ahead and I will cut the cedar limbs. They might be 10 feet long at the base because we got a big tree that we're working with. I'll go ahead and cut them off halfway, and then I'll cut them up at the trunk. So then there's two things going on there. You want to have similar sizes when you're putting things into the tank so they burn evenly as much as possible. So then I have the fine material, and then I have the bigger chunk closer to the trunk. And I can add the bigger chunks all kind of at the same time, and then they'll burn appropriately based on their size, because it takes, it's a time-size ratio in terms of how long it takes to get the charring done. And then you have the finer material for adding on, especially at the end. Like to start it, you want fine material because you want to get something going quick. And then at the end, you want to have some fine material so that you're getting a lot of heat to kind of finish everything off. But you don't want to have like these big, you don't want to put in a 4-inch limb right at the end because there's not enough time for that char to be made. And once you get it put in there, then, or once you get it made, then you can add it to things like compost. So I've added it to cattle bedding. As the cows were in the yard eating hay, pooping, peeing. One of the statistics that I've heard, and I say this every time, I can't believe the statistic. They've done studies, a study's been done of adding char to, doing a compost pile of animal bedding, and that was the control. And then they added char to the bedding and did the composting. And then they did the char as the cows were eating, the bedding was accumulating and adding the char at the same time. And the control set the baseline, and then I think it doubled the amount of nitrogen in the compost for when it was added at the composting time. But when it was added when the cows were there peeing, in particular, it tenfolded the nitrogen in the final compost. I mean, tenfolded. I mean, so, and when I bought a tote of char right before going to this workshop, the guy that sold it to me said, you can pay for your char bill by the nitrogen that you save, but when you're adding it to livestock. You can pay for your char bill in the nitrogen fertilizer that you've kept from leaving your farm, if you have livestock. So you can improve the value of your fertilizer. One thing to watch out for if you're adding it to the bedding and you're an NOP certified organic producer raising produce and composting and making greenhouse potting mix from that compost. Normally we get like 140, 150 degrees when we pile up our bedding and compost it. So we meet the NOP requirements of over 131 degrees for a period of time. And so that's compost. And so then we can take that, use it in our potting mix in our greenhouse. Because when you have lettuce and you're raising it in a pot for 30 days, you put it out in the field, you harvest it 30 days later, 60 days. The NOP requires non-composted manure, so anything besides the besides the definition of compost has to be treated like raw manure. And now you have anything that touches the ground, 120 days you have to wait before you can harvest. So it's very important that if we're using or compost in our potting mix, that it meets the definition of NOP compost. And what happened when I got this char from Missouri, I added quite a bit of carbon basically to the bedding. And the cows tromped it in and it worked great. But then when I piled it up to compost it, I had a little bit of an effort probing my compost to find 131 degrees. It was like 128. And I found 131 and I'm like, aha, here it is. So, Corinne, sorry if. But I found it. I have a picture of that thermometer saying 132 degrees in my compost pile. So I met the requirement, but I had to look for it. Oh, yeah.
When you're adding the biochar to compost or the bedding, what's the ratio? Is there a recipe that you use?
I put a couple buckets out a week.
5-gallon buckets or?
5-gallon buckets, yeah. Maybe more than that. Maybe 4 gallons or 4 buckets a week. There's not really a ratio, but just something to think about. And there might be a compost calculator out there now that you could do this with. The thing you want to pay attention to is that biochar is almost pure carbon. And so when you're thinking carbon to nitrogen ratios and you're building your compost pile, you want to have a certain starting ratio so you can get the heating. That would be the guideline that I would give you, is that you want to make sure your carbon-nitrogen ratios are balanced. Because like for me, like I added all this carbon and I had a hard time getting my temperature up because that effectively lowered my nitrogen ratio in the pile. Ironically, it increased my nitrogen capacity in the pile, so then the cows, because most of the nitrogen from livestock actually is in the urine. So when you have a situation where you can't capture the urine, it either goes into the ground or runs off or volatilizes if you don't have enough carbon.
Is that an issue though, just because like you sucked in more of the nitrogen and so that lowered your C-N ratio? Because the carbon should be breaking down, right? So that
No.
shouldn't interact. It's not an active carbon part, right?
It's active in the compost in that it's binding, it's sequestering nitrogen. And so the only factor that's really, what I'm saying as a guideline is that you want to pay attention to how much carbon you're putting in case you need to have a certain temperature to reach for organic certification.
One question, can you go back one slide?
I think so.
Just a picture of the finished product.
Yeah.
What am I looking at here as far as size-wise? How big are the chunks? Are like this?
Biggest one, this one here is probably about like that big.
Okay.
And
If you didn't break it down in any other way after we mix it in with your compost, you left it at that size, or did you
Wh-
grind it down?
When I got the char for the compost, I bought it. It came in a tote bag. It was like a tote bag on a pallet that I got off the back of a truck. It was already fairly fine. I thought it was going to be like cornmeal. It turned out to be a little more chunky than that, but for that use, it didn't matter.
Hi, I'm so sorry to interrupt. The silent auction is going to end within a couple minutes.
Oh, 3 minutes.
Sharing that, I don't want to, by all means, continue.
So establish your priorities and run like the wind. I won't take it personally. So now with this, so it depends on the use. So, and so the next slides here are, this is one use that we've done. We've added it to our chicken house. And when I got this bag from Missouri, I put a bucket in each of our chicken houses before I left for the workshop. Like the char arrived the day before, I did this, I went to the workshop, I came back, it was gone. Every single little speck of that char was gone. And every one of those little chicken nuggets was black and white. They ate it all and pooped it out by the time, just, whatever, 6 hours going to this workshop, or 7 hours. And it was in the springtime. And so one of the problems you have in a chicken house is that it's hard to keep enough bedding in there in the springtime because you've accumulated all this nitrogen-rich manure, and now the weather's warming, and then things are starting to volatilize, and you can get an ammonia problem in your house pretty quick. And so the thing I noticed was that the ammonia smell in the house that was there in the morning was gone in the afternoon because of the added carbon to the material. We also now add char to, and we use our own farm-made char, and we add that to our feed whenever we grind chicken feed or for hog feed. And so you get a double benefit there. You're getting the nitrogen sequestration, and you're getting this health benefit for the birds. It's absorbing free radicals, it's absorbing excess nitrogen in their gut system, and if there's any kind of toxins or mycotoxins in the feed, it just absorbs that and out it goes. So it's really a health thing for the birds. The cows, I can just put that in their mineral mix, free mix, and then they'll actually pick it up and crunch, 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 and eat it up, and they love it. And Dell was actually talking about adding char to their lick tanks and noticing how the dung beetles really started to proliferate in that area. And so this is one of the best ways to use char, is actually add it to a livestock component of the farm, because you're getting the fertility addition to the char, which I have added char to my soil without any type of charging, without any type of fertility additives. And what happens is the plants go yellow, because you've effectively added a nitrogen sponge to your soil, and it just sucks in the nitrogen, binds it to the carbon, and eventually it'll get loose. The plants will be able to access it, but there's initially, it's like if you put wood in your soil, there's going to initially be a fertility tie-up. And the next year the fertility tie-up didn't happen. So you have the benefit then of this organic matter, or this char, I call it permanent organic matter, but then the fertility issue kind of stabilizes and balances. And there's proof that animals will eat it. They got black, they should be pink noses. So, and yeah, I just put it in the pig yard, and they go crazy. They just eat it up and chomp on it, and I've seen videos of guys that make char too, and they chomp it just like a chocolate bar. A little crunchy for me, but yep.
Are there any feed restrictions as far as using, like, I guess, an organic source char for feed on livestock?
This is interesting, because when I took the workshop, Kelpie was really cautious of bringing a livestock addition. Like it's not an approved material, and I think the USDA came around or something? No? Okay, well.
Well, it's coming from your land that you could document has not been treated, what's the difference of that and the forage that you're eating?
So I don't know. What I will say is that the FDA, there's the FDA and there's the Association of Animal Feed Control Officers. It is not an approved feed additive. That being said, I believe there is like a caveat for if like you are making the decision on your farm for your animals, as opposed to if you are like a feed blender and you're selling to a, co-op or whatever. I think there are different regulations for that. Do not quote me on that.
Well, and one dynamic on that, you said the name, I can't remember it, it's like the APP.
AFCO, yeah.
That is actually a private pet food regulating organization. So it's not a federally, doesn't have federal authority as I understand it.
Yeah, they make recommendations.
But it's universal among feed makers. And so if you want to be a feed maker in the United States, you abide by this association for some reason. I don't know. I'm not a member. The thing that I did with, when I saw this char addition and I went to the workshop and it was gone, I gave him another bucket the next day, it was gone. Gave him another bucket the next day, it was gone. I was like, all right, you birds. I'm just going to keep bucketing it char into this house until you stop eating it and see how long it takes.
Aren't your eggs certified organic? So like, you made it work, right?
Yeah.
That was his question, right?
Well, I think it was a kind of a sidetrack a little bit, because we are adding it to feed. But officially in the United States, I don't know that anybody else is as a feed maker. And then I'm coming back to like how much is too much. And what I did notice was that the chickens actually reduced their egg production when I really went happy with kept giving them all the char. And it makes sense because nitrogen is the foundation of protein, and that's going to be kept up. I think I was up to 3.5 buckets a day, and then I noticed the egg drop, and I was like, okay, we enough with that experiment, huh? We have about 750, 800 birds. Yeah.
Were they eating the biochar in place of their feed or in addition?
In addition to. Yeah.
So you didn't notice any reduction in what the amount of feed they were eating?
The feed didn't change, but the egg production dropped because it was probably binding up the nitrogen they need or the protein they needed to make the eggs.
I think some of the cattle, the grazers and cattle owners that feed it, the livestock, would be like 1 to 2 ounces per animal unit per day.
Okay.
And I'm sure it varies, between a ruminant and a monogastric animal. But,
Mm-hmm.
it's like a mineral supplement. It's not crazy amounts that
Right.
you have to feed to get the fat.
Right.
The research that we've done on adding biochar to cattle diets, we're looking at 1% or less of their daily intake. Yeah.
So 0.2%. So
Yeah.
that's like 1 to 3 ounces for a
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you're spot on.
not much.
Yeah.
But so in these cases where it's being added to a livestock component on the farm, you're getting the fertility addition to the char. You're inoculating it with microbes, especially in cattle. But with chickens, if you composted it, or if you add it to something that you're composting, now you've got char with fertility, with microbes, and an amendment for your soil that's going to be there for 10,000 years and giving benefit. And so that's one of the key things too with biochar is that it's in your soil forever, effectively, from our perspective, or from my own perspective. It's not something that has to continue to be applied. it's going to be there for as long as you're alive.
Well, and again, from a producer's lens, it also helps stabilize that carbon. There's a lot of research that shows that when you apply biochar and then you apply compost or manure, that compost or manure breaks down more slowly and evenly throughout your season.
Mhm.
So, Evrett, can you talk about how you apply this to your beds then? Because you said direct application just turns things yellow and ties up the nitrogen. So is it only via the compost that makes it into your beds, or how do you apply it?
Right now, it's via compost and it's via animal feed, like fed to the animals.
You grind it up in your hammer mill?
I do when I add it to the chicken feed. Yeah. So it goes through. I use. I have the hammers running real slow, and it goes through like a 1-inch.
And you wet it
Screen.
down probably before you do that.
I would not recommend wetting it down. It is a little bit damp because we extinguish it with water. So it's not. I think it's nice when I work with it and it's frozen, because I don't have to worry about it, because otherwise it's going to stick when I get it in there. So if there is dampness, and then I'm sure to add it with the stream of, say, like, corn going in there, so that there's moisture gets absorbed.
I've done it dry before, and it's just a giant black cloud.
Yeah.
It looks like it's gonna blow up, so I
Yeah.
don't do that.
If there's no moisture, it's definitely a powdery mess. Yeah, but yeah.
Have you tried adding it to your greenhouse mix at all?
That's something I'm experimenting with. One of my missions or motivations is to try to have as many things from on the farm as I can. So having the compost for the potting mix is one way. And then I started working with some leaf mold. But we still have like a peat moss type addition for our potting mix. And so I've looked at substitutes for that. Perlite sometimes comes into the picture once in a while. But I've started looking at studies in terms of using char as a perlite or a peat moss substitute. And I've seen some studies. The challenge that I would have is that they're working with uniform particulate sizes, or like a fairly narrow range of particulate size. And we've got a whole range. And if I tried to make the bigger ones smaller, then I'd end up with a powder. And so it takes some juggling and figuring probably to get that to work. But it's in the works. We're thinking about it.
How does this impact organic certification? Do you have to document the materials going into it, like you're not burning treated lumber or something, or?
Yep, our certifier wants to know what the source materials are, and has to be untreated, unpainted. They actually had to think about it for a while, because the biochar process, since it's 1,000 degrees of heat, is defined as a synthetic for organic. Anything over, I think, 400 degrees processing makes something synthetic in the organic eyes. And so if you look on the organic regulation, activated charcoal is allowed, but it's under the listing of approved synthetics in organic production. So yeah, our certifier had to think about it for a while, kind of like, is this?
Even though it's a natural fire that produces that 1,000 degrees?
When you have definitions and bureaucracy, there's no kind of like, well, come on.
Are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons a concern? Have you used it
Complete combustion.
It's toxic, right?
My experience has been, part of what I do is a lot of testing of biochars, sending it off to labs, and nothing that I've seen from any of the biochars from these like very high-tech places that are producing biochar for a living to this more low-tech, open burn style has demonstrated PAHs or furans or dioxins or any of those concerns. I don't know I hear this question a lot, and I'm not sure. It seems like it has been a problem in the biochar industry in the past, and I don't know if that is like something that is not maybe totally organic or totally biomass, you know, or what that comes from. It has not been my experience.
So we'll leave that question unanswered and open a little bit.
Yeah.
What I have seen in the plant growth though, like after, and once in a while I'll put it in a chicken yard, like in the spring, it gets wet and sloppy. Chickens have been there all winter and there's lots of fertility, so I'll put char on the soil around the house. And then that takes care of the odor, absorbs the nitrogen, and it also shows up later in terms of when we're planting the next crop down the road. You can tell where that char has been mixed in, and the plants really respond to that char. And it's not, you know, like say like if peppers were planted there, I've seen it where too much nitrogen is going to be huge peppers, no peppers, or huge plants but no peppers. And when you have the char there, it's really nice sized plants and just loads and loads of peppers. So you can tell by that there's a balance of carbon and nitrogen. The next workshop is streaming in, so we should probably
You get the hook.
call it a wrap.